to Bodies Without Organs, a brand new podcast about the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze. The first thing I'm going to ask, though, is it Gilles or is it Gilles? Because I suddenly realise I'm not sure I know that.
That's a good question, actually.
I assume it's Gilles.
I think I've heard both. I think when you it's when you get it's French, right? So I feel like it's a language that's built on artistic license to some extent. So maybe both's fine. As long as we get Deleuze right, I think that's okay.
That's fine. My name is Sean. I am no one of any particular note, and I am joined here by Matt. Matt, would you like to introduce yourself to the lovely people at home?
Yeah, my name's Matt Coon. I blog under the name Xenogothic, and I'm very excited to be chatting about Deleuze.
Yeah. Matt, you are a published author, which is very, very exciting. You had a book out earlier, back in the before times, right at the last thing I did before Corona was come up to London for the Mark Fisher Memorial lecture, where I bought a copy of your book Egress, which I have to admit I am yet to read, because as soon as I bought it, things became very stressful, and suddenly I wanted to read more comforting things.
Yeah, it really wasn't the book to come out at that. We had the launch for it literally 10 days before the UK went into lockdown. So yeah, it really was pretty bad timing for a pretty melancholic book to come out. It's not what anyone wants to read. But hopefully this will be much more lighthearted. So it's we take the rough with the smooth.
You also edited and introduced a new book from Repeater, which is called Post-Capitalist Desire. The last lectures of Mark Fisher, which came out very, very recently as well. So
yeah, Post-Capitalist Desire came out in October. Of Mark's final lectures. That is it's quite well timed with this, because one of the things that Mark's talking about his sort of view for the future in there, but he's going all the way back to the 70s and talking about that sort of moment in left wing thought and kind of how everything went wrong. We ended up here. But there's a few times where he mentions that he has no Deleuze or Guattari on the reading list, and they are that's almost a crime as far as he's concerned. But they are there sort of implicitly throughout everything else, and just that kind of thought really has been dragging them both D and G back from the periphery. Really, it feels like they are always implicitly everywhere, it feels like. So it's nice to actually engage with them head on for a change.
Yeah, the haunting presence of Deleuze and Guattari, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
To explain a little bit about what the format of this podcast is going to be, as far as we are anticipating it right now, because obviously we are going to experiment and see what works over the coming weeks and months. But how we're imagining it at the moment is each episode is going to be dedicated to a particular concept or theory or theme that we find in the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari. So, and we are kicking off with the body without organs, because the name of this podcast is Bodies Without Organs. It felt sort of sensible to kick off with an explanation about why we called that. We aren't quite sure what we're going to do next, which is quite exciting. Maybe we'll figure that out over the course of this recording. What we are keen on doing, or at least the reason why I kind of thought up the idea of doing this podcast and then dragging Matt kicking and screaming with me, was because similarly to what you're saying, Deleuze is a figure who's kind of been in the background of a lot of stuff I've been interested in and a lot of stuff I've read. Back in 2016, I believe it was, when I was kind of because the beginning of the last decade, I sort of went through a bit of a phase of being really into Nick Land, and became looking back on it, quite dangerously interested in the Dark Enlightenment and things like that. And that kind of experience prompted me to go, well, I probably ought to read Anti-Oedipus then, because something that lies in the background of a lot of that kind of nihilistic, techno-capital, anti-democratic thought are very particular interpretations of the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari. So I went along and read Anti-Oedipus, and it thoroughly deprogrammed me. And I sort of like, well, wait a minute, all this right-wing nonsense is obviously just sort of like an inappropriate seizure of a much more interesting philosophy. So Anti-Oedipus is the longest work of Deleuze and Guattari's I've read and played. Although in terms of like my personal philosophical views, it didn't initially sort of like alter too much about what I believed, sort of like about certain philosophical fundamentals, but it was a fascinating and just like really oddly like healing book in a way. Sort of like because what it did get me to think very strongly about was what was capitalism and what capitalism does, and especially the role of desire in the generation of the capital, in the mechanism of working of the capitalist economy and capitalist society. So in a way, sort of like Deleuze and Guattari pulled me back from what was probably quite a bad brink I was teetering on, and made me the sort of like flamboyant leftist who listens to Trash Future that I am today.
I think that they have a powerful effect on a lot of people. Mine was slightly different in that I'd never even studied philosophy formally at all until 2016 as well. But it was sort of 3 years prior to that I first came across A Thousand Plateaus as a just graduated photography student, and it totally smashed my brain in. And sort of then set on a quest to be like, I want to know what this book is about. I want to understand this hot mess. And I think it's what's amazing about that, looking back, is that whilst I think we'll be hopefully we'll be able to help each other out as much as grasping these individual concepts are. But as far as these works go, I feel like every time you reread them or even just approach them, there's something new to be gleaned from them. It truly is a truly inexhaustible body of work, I think, that just never gets old. So yeah, I think in a weird way, it was my first love, and it's a love that has yet to be exhausted.
Yeah, and yeah, precisely what I'm hoping will happen for both of us and for the listeners as well over the course of this podcast is that we will. Well, really, we will go on a journey together and increase and broaden our own knowledge and understanding of Deleuze and Guattari, as well as, casting our eyes to the horizon with our own thoughts as well, and sort of and see what we can take from them, what we can glean from them for our own uses, in particular, because there is this. This is something we're going to talk about in greater detail. There's this emphasis on the practical in Deleuze and Guattari, which is quite rare. I'm going to say it's rare in contemporary philosophy, that there is this emphasis on philosophy as a practice that alters you and alters the world around you as you are doing it, and that is why it is valuable. That is why you should be doing it.
Yeah, there's a weird contradiction in there almost that I think is actually pretty prescient to this concept of a body without organs. That I feel like it's the one thing that really resonates with me about Deleuze's work still, is that he has this whole sense of being within the depths of things, not just lingering at the surface. And the body without organs is one way of doing that, and so we can unpack that. But more generally, anyway, I think that there's this. It's that sense has this like double meaning. That means as much going out and being in the world and acting, as much as it means there's actually this sort of there's also a depth of knowledge that can be employed to better appreciate that kind of experience. So it's like this. It truly is. I think it's this anti-Cartesianism in the sense that this is not there is no split between body and mind here. To think deeply is as much, is as important as going and walking out deep into the forest or something, and that they have that same, that both are treated as equal experiences and having very similar affects maybe, and that's pretty powerful, I think, because there's a way in there no matter where you're coming from. I think there's a it's a sort of body of work that implores you to explore the other side.
Yes, absolutely. And the experience of reading them is just it is very unique because it is just it's fun, it's energizing, it's exciting, it's something that can literally get your heart racing almost, because there is just this frenetic energy kind of sort of like exploding out of the text. In a way that is very reminiscent of Nietzsche's work, which is famously very, very literary and very, very and very just readable, and again, like the word I want to emphasize is just fun. Like, there's something fun about reading these guys. It doesn't feel like you're reading boring old philosophy. It feels like I don't know. I was going to say something like that. It feels like the drunk at the pub who's just sort of like really like zeroed in on you and just like is just like pouring these thoughts into you, and you kind of can't step away. Only that experience only as a positive, entertaining, fun one that is transformative and not a bit threatening.
It's one you can walk away from when you need to, and then always come back. It's not just a torrent. Yeah.
Well, without further ado, maybe we should zero in a little bit and laser focus down on to the body without organs. So, Matt, perhaps you'd like to kick us off with your thoughts on this, on the meaning of this. And I should say before we begin, I think the key text that we are drawing from for this is How to Make Yourself a Body Without Organs, which is one of the essays in A Thousand Plateaus.
So, a brief overview of what the body without organs is. And I always think the best way to think of it is as literally as starting with the body, just as Deleuze sort of presents it to us. But I think the sort of the slippery thing about this concept is that it's actually asking us to step back from representation, or step back from the body as we understand it as being quite literally organized. There's a line in a song actually that I was been listening to recently where this guy sings about looking up at the moon without abstraction. What is it to think of the moon as a floating, rock in outer space? And to actually just think of the moon as it is kind of this weird process. It's kind of quite trippy to actually just look at things as they are. And I feel like for Deleuze, that's sort of part of the what's useful about this concept. That actually, when we think about how we understand how our bodies work, we take a lot of things for granted. So in this chapter that we were looking at in A Thousand Plateaus, he draws on William Burroughs, who puts forward a bunch of alternative ideas for how the body should function. So what
I've actually got the Burroughs quote here, which I'll just read quickly. The human body is scandalously inefficient. Instead of a mouth and an anus to get out of order, why not have one all-purpose hole to eat and eliminate? We could seal up nose and mouth, fill in the stomach, make an air hole direct into the lungs where it should have been in the first place.
Yeah, so it's as if Burroughs is describing a quite horrific version of the body as we know it, but actually, from maybe a machinic or an engineering point of view, it makes total sense. So it's as if the body without organs is this way of this quite provocative concept that's nevertheless trying to make us interrogate. It forces us to interrogate this reality that's somewhere in between how we understand our bodies as living in them, and also how we understand the body through these other sort of systems of knowledge that we have around us. And so Deleuze is kind of asking us to flatten all of that out, strip it all back, and get back to this sort of consistent body, as it were. And how do we think about that kind of becomes this question that unfolds throughout loads of his work.
Yes, it's thinking of in terms of specifics, because what Deleuze and Guattari tell us in this chapter is that the body without organs is not opposed to the organs, it's not opposed to organs, it's opposed to the organism, which they borrow. I mean, the expression "body without organs" is that they lift directly from Artaud, from his plane, to be done with the judgment of God, or beyond the judgment of God, and so they place the organism as under the remit of the judgment of God in their vocabulary, which is stands in for this kind of finalized, settled, stratified, to use their vocabulary, kind of like decided form of what the body is and how it is, again, literally organized, that it stands as an organism with its parts placed in the correct order, with all of the functions of it happening smoothly. And we can see in this an attack on the concept of the natural, maybe, as well. Because specific, like thinking about sort of like, because it can sound a little bit sort of abstract, talking about, well, what other things can we do with our bodies other than the things that we are like used to, and from a queer perspective, like there's some really, really obvious things you can say there. Say, well, by having queer sex, for instance, by having forms of sex which are totally and sort of like fundamentally like unproductive, which can't do the social function of reproduction as it is understood, where it is I remember, this is completely somewhat tangential, but I remember when I used to watch that terrible debate show on like BBC Two on Sunday mornings, and it was called like The Big Questions or something like that.
Yeah.
Which was I think it was the guy from like Watchdog presented. But anyway, I remember there was a debate on there once, and it was basically just some kind of like variation of the gays, do we need them? And there was a particular guy there who was a fundamentalist Christian who insisted that gay sex is literally an impossibility, like it can't happen because you have to, I don't know why would I remember these words 10 years later, but he said because you have to press into service like parts of our body which our most perfect creator gave us, which weren't intended for that function. And kind of precisely what Deleuze and Guattari are kind of like throwing open there is basically says who what they're for, says who what are the proper functions of the organs that are atop the organless body.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of something I was reading today as well that was about giraffes, of all things. Not to compare the gays and giraffes, but it's like it falls into this. It's this limitation that we put on, the human body especially. Like, what is natural for humans? I mean, I think that the one thing to say, whether it's a challenge on nature, I suppose it's that it's our conception of nature, or the ways that we have limited nature, when actually we should, we understand nature as this kind of limitless. I was going to say thing, but I suppose it's not even that. Nature is nature, and I guess in that sense, it's why I think one of the more, though it's not explicitly talking about the body without organs, one of the biggest influences on Deleuze for this kind of thinking is Spinoza, and Spinoza's conception of nature, and Deleuze talks about this constantly throughout his works. There's like the most famous line being in his book Expressionism in Philosophy, where he says that after through this reading of Spinoza, he suggests that we don't yet know what our body can do. But also in Difference and Repetition, he has this other sort of twist on this, which is far more firm. It's less of a question or a kind of open statement. But he says, expression in nature is never a final symbolization, but always and everywhere a causal explication. And there's this kind of challenge there where he acknowledges that, yes, I mean, we can kind of thank psychoanalysis and its conception of desire for undoing that understanding of sex only being for reproduction, and that other kinds of sex just don't make sense. But there's also, I think Deleuze suggests that whilst that's all well and good and very helpful for us to understand as a society, there's nevertheless this misstep that happens in psychoanalysis of symbolization, where it's I guess symbolization is kind of it's I found a a dictionary definition for this rather earlier, just for the sake of brevity, which is symbolization is it described as an unconscious mental process whereby one object or idea comes to stand in for another through some part. So it's almost to say that in that sense, when we think about how queer sex is not is different in kind to heterosexual sex or whatever. The issue that we have there is that we start to view it as like an alternative to, or a variation on, when actually they're both just expressions of desire. So in kind of placing these, in compartmentalizing these variations, we don't actually help ourselves understanding in this kind of, nature as itself. And this is kind of Spinoza's main suggestion, right? Is what is nature naturing? And so I think it's that causal explication that just sort of is this suggestion that nature just bounds outwards, kind of without thinking. It's like it's almost impossible for us to sort of articulate, because our own language restricts these things. And that's why I was thinking of giraffes, to kind of go back to that point, where I was reading some article, I think it was in the London Review of Books of all places, and someone was writing about how giraffes just don't make sense. Maybe we understand that for our own aesthetic standards, but they were making this point that giraffes only drink every few days because their necks are so long. When they go down to drink, it's actually a very dizzying process for them, so they don't drink often, even though they obviously need it. And there was something else in there, but actually, like 80% of sexual contact that giraffes have is homosexual. And I can't remember if they even had a reason for this, or even if it's known. But it's, there's always the arguments made that that homosexuality exists in nature, so it must be therefore natural. But it's almost as if to say that nature isn't natural. Nature's kind of dumb, and we can't really apply any sort of we can't really apply any of our own standards to these different things. We can't really make these kinds of judgments. To be done with the judgment of God is just to kind of strip back all of that symbolization, not to make excuses for different kinds of desires and be able to explain them away, but understand them sort of from within the depths of what desire actually is. And it's that sort of like process that we're barely ready to kind of comprehend with. And what is required for that is to kind of strip away so much of thinking that we've actually done, which I think is partly there's this whole sense of, I'll actually probably leave it there because that's a whole other tangent. But Deleuze goes all the way back to the Stoics in that regard, to sort of their sense of nature, just that nature is only made up of bodies, and this is something that he does in Logic of Sense. Where it's that there's no such they have an idea of there's the body and there's the soul, and that's kind of what you get later on, and they have a conception of what a soul is, but a soul is still sort of within the corporeal realm. Everything is a body, and those bodies exist in causal relations, and that's not to say that these bodies affect each other and have it's just flat. It's this holistic sense of nature, where everything is a body. And going back to that and trying to grasp that within the midst of our own actual contemporary environment is kind of this really trippy thing to do. But what we can gain from that is kind of, it requires that we not just, peel back all of our prejudices, even the ones that are kind of, you could say, quote unquote, good prejudices. We need to understand things as they are in the depths of things. And the implications for that are mind-boggling.
There's a couple of points I want to make, kind of stemming off that. Firstly, I want to talk to pick up the thread about psychoanalysis a little bit. There's a book I read last year, but I don't believe I finished it actually, called Towards a Gay Communism by Mario Mieli, which was a manifesto essentially by a really, really pioneering sort of early queer liberation theorist, the Italian Mario Mieli, who published this book in 1977. And I will also just throw a little caveat of it has, I will be generous and say, a few historical missteps around the question of pedo liberation in there. However, a very, very, a very, very good point he makes in that is he looks at Freud's essay, or 3 essays on human sexuality, which is one of the foundational essays of psychoanalysis, which is Freud doing the Freud thing of talking about sort of why is sex, why have we these feelings, and why is it to do with mother and all that. And but there's some this is one of his essays that Freud returns to numerous times in his career, and it is a proper footnotes within footnotes kind of thing, places where the footnote takes up more than the page and the text does. And in particular, Miele draws our attention to a remark that Freud makes in one of the footnotes, where he is talking about the notion that in childhood, libido is polymorphously perverse, as Freud puts it. That libido or sexual drive is something which is kind of like in the child, in the pre-adolescent, is kind of like totally untethered almost, and that's sort of like imprint, and that it is just kind of like roves around the body almost. And though Freud does, of course, say in there, it fixates in certain places, first of all on the mouth, and then the anus, and then the great drama of Oedipus and all that. But it, in principle, there isn't any reason why it can't settle on anything. And Freud still sort of suggests that at its root, libido, that is actually what libido is like at its purest, that it actually can be anything, and it can actually go anywhere and turn anything, any part of the body, any person, any part of nature into an erotic site. And what Freud says here, and this is kind of one of those comments that he kind of raises, and you almost get the impression that he's almost a little bit wary of what he's suggesting, kind of steps away from it, as he states that heterosexuality is as much a problem to be explained by psychoanalysis as homosexuality is. And you get the impression that Freud has detected certain truths about what desire is at root, what desire is at its kind of like most primordial form, and that it can just go anywhere. But over the course of the hundreds of thousands of years of human history, it has become settled into particular ways. And as you said, even our understanding of the deviations, as it were, from that is, even when we're trying to be positive about it, is still very, very tied in with that, which is why, sort of like a constant question in queer thought and queer theory is sort of like, well, what actually is the meaning of our queer sex? And including sort of like its more radical moments, you get people who sort of like the questioning of the notion of monogamy, for instance, of the nuclear family, saying, so why should we limit? Why do these limits exist? What are they for? By what justification are they imposed on us? And this led to, in the early American queer liberation movement, around particularly a guy called Harry Hay, I think his name was, who again kind of like caveat around certain historical missteps around pedo liberation. Again, kind of like, but the point he kind of like expressed very like fervently is this question around sort of like why should the liberated gay man want to conform himself and assimilate into heterosexual society? Like, why do we continue to understand our desire in relation to the desire of the oppressing norm, essentially? Second point I want to make is just talking about what you brought up there with logic of sense, and I think this should lead us to a broader discussion about the body without organs, is when in a logic of sense, when Deleuze raises the example of the Stoics and discusses because although like the Stoical philosophy, the universe is composed of bodies, like you said, what Deleuze is really interested in and kind of like focuses in on when he introduces the Stoics is the fact that there's actually like a dichotomy that the Stoics introduce, which is between the body and the event. And the event is something that, in Deleuze's language in this book, it says it's something that kind of like inheres upon the body, but isn't the body. Like the event, the happening, the becoming, is something that, the body of course has to be there for there to be the event, but the event and the body are not the same. They are qualitatively different from one another, and but their relationality is such that if we were to say that the body has been cut, we couldn't say the body has been cut. We would talk about sort of the event of cutting upon the body. And what Deleuze kind of like brings up for us to question here, in kind of like sort of like a classic sort of like post-structuralist flipping of tables, is to point out that we've tended to assume that in broadly speaking, in the history of Western philosophy, that events and happenings are less real because they are changeable things that happen in time, as opposed to the really real things, which are the eternal, unchanging things. It just points out, but what could be more intimate to a body than to be cut? Why is the reality of the event less so when the event is really all we ever actually kind of like have to deal with the bodies are something that are kind of constantly almost like falling out of our grasp because we are always caught up in the midst of the event. And he kind of, over the course of the Logic of Sense, he plays with that idea a lot of kind of like the ever retreat of the thing we're reaching for. Like when he talks about, for example, the series of names or denotations. In fact, you have this kind of ever-expanding series of the thing that is denoted and then the denotation. The logical problem, the logical sort of like problem here, and it being a problem because it extends into infinity, is that once something has been named, it's the name of the thing is itself a thing, which therefore can also be denoted, can also be named, and producing this infinite series of the denoted and the denotation moving in parallel with one another in this kind of like confusing hazy dance with one another almost as one becomes the other, constantly going into infinity. That isn't although that isn't especially relevant to a discussion about the body without organs itself. So kind of building on building on what you were saying there about the body without organs being a relationship with our own body. Of course, Deleuze does also think that the body without organs, everything has a body without organs, including capital and the state, because there's an extent to which, in terms of the philosophical meaning of the body without organs, and this is the Spinozist in Deleuze coming out here really, is there's an extent to which the body without organs is the surface upon which any such thing can happen at all. It isn't. It isn't a plain surface, though. There are, when Deleuze talks about the body without organs, it is a plural. It is bodies without organs. Actually, just for sake of example, I will read a brief extract from the essay in A Thousand Plateaus. Give an example. He says here, the body without organs, it is already underway the moment the body has had enough of organs and wants to slough them off or loses them. A long procession. The hypochondriac body. The organs are destroyed, the damage has already been done, nothing happens anymore. The paranoid body. The organs are continually under attack by outside forces, but are also restored by outside energies. The schizo body, waging its own active internal struggle against the organs at the price of catatonia. The drugged body, the experimental schizo, the masochist body. It is poorly understood in terms of pain. It is fundamentally a question of the body without organs. The body without organs, the different types of body without organ, condition the events that may occur upon it. And I want to, because I've been talking for a while, so I want to kind of throw this back to you, Matt. How does this notion of the body without organs as the territory upon which things occur play out?
I mean, one thing that kept coming to mind throughout your points, I think maybe a thread that maybe we'll pull these together is that I think partly what connects this philosophical understanding to maybe a potential political understanding can be found, like most things, in Marx. And I always think of how there's this shift in Karl Marx's writings, with Engels, it should be said, on his understanding of desire. And as you say, there's this separation between bodies and events. I think on the very first page of Capital, there's a footnote pointing to a Mr. Nicholas Barbon, I think, off the top of my head anyway, where Barbon defines desire as a natural thing, but he compares it to, it's like a desire is to is like a hunger, quite literally assigning desire to an organ. as if to say desire. The body has desires, as in to say that the body desires food, or the body desires warmth, things like that. But later on in the Communist Manifesto, Marx starts talking about how desire is insatiable, and it has no end. We'll always desire more things. So there's this, and I think it's that, in a way, that shift, though it's very subtle, and I say it that way because I think maybe that pads out the linguistic turn that Deleuze deploys, which is that for him, the difference between a body and an event is that the body is to say, yeah, the body has desires. The event is the body desires. To say that what something has or what it possesses is to sort of give it a quality, to sort of to categorize the thing in some way. Whereas to say what this thing does of its own volition, I think in John Roth gives the example of a tree. You can say a tree is green, or you can say the tree greens. And that kind of fits, I think, better with maybe sort of Deleuze's logic of sense stuff, where he's playing with the sort of the surreality of Lewis Carroll and things like this, where the tree greens is, grammatically grammatically it works. The green isn't usually a verb, but you can make sense of it. But kind of it's the sort of sentence that the more you think about it, the more it kind of it suggests this deeper appreciation of what a tree is, in a way. To say a tree is green is kind of this surface level, but to say a tree greens points to this deeper process, a kind of unseen, maybe unconscious process, and you can then ask questions of like, why is a tree green, rather than anyway. And I think it's that kind of shift here that to then talk about why as the body organs as a place where things happen, or where anything can happen. I think it's that kind of understanding of what it means to of what happenings are, precisely, to sort of say, it's the difference between in my kitchen I am likely to make food, or to sort of say, I don't know, like these analogies are getting complicated now and pretty bad, but I suppose Deleuze gives the best example himself, right? So, he has that famous line in, I'm not sure if it's Anti-Oedipus or A Thousand Plateaus, but he says, the model for how to be in the world is always, a schizophrenic out for a walk, is far better a model for, I can't remember now, whatever, than like a neurotic on a couch. I think it's precisely that kind of, it's that same process where, the psychoanalyst sits before a patient and sort of says, well, you have desires, or you have neuroses. Why do you have, these are the things that, and then how do, what symbols can we bring into this space, somewhat artificially, to explain these singular things, that these qualities that you have. Whereas a schizophrenic out for a walk just does. A schizophrenic schizophrenizes. That you can't just the issue perhaps potentially for psychoanalysis at that time is it's just sort of it's to you embrace this kind of another example maybe is the one, I think another one that Deleuze kind of alludes to is Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway, where you have precisely, I suppose that's probably opening a can of worms in itself, but it's a book that centres around walking through London specifically. You have the wife of the Prime Minister who's walking, she's doing a number of menial tasks. She's going to buy flowers, and she's planning for a dinner party, and blah 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 blah. And she's kind of crosses paths with, not sure if he's a schizophrenic at least, but a suicidal war hero, Septimus Smith. And Septimus has this far more, he's neurotic and he's suicidal for a start, but he has this quite radical way of engaging with the world where as he walks around, his mind wanders with him, and it's that anti-Cartesianism where Mrs. Dalloway walks around London because she has an idea. She has an ideal, or an idea in a sort of Platonic sense. She has a goal, and she's going to do these different specific things to make that thing happen, to make her party happen. Whereas Septimus wanders around and is totally, at the mercy of the event, and not just in the present, but also the past and the future, where he seems to sort of prefigure his own demise. But also he's haunted by his war experiences. It's kind of like here, there's a PTSD element where any kind of event. It's not to say that a car backfires and he thinks it sounds like a bomb. A car backfires and he is back on the battlefield. There's no separation. There's no symbolization. He's in all places at all times. So I think maybe in that sense, it's not just a spatial thing, but also like I think when we talk about planes, especially, or strata, or whatever else, to use the terminology of Deleuze and Guattari, it's never quite, it's spatio-temporal in that sense. It's not just that anything can happen in London, but I mean that's true in a lot of ways, but that's more true maybe for the schizophrenic, where it's not just that anything can happen, that anything, literally anything, they can travel the world almost, or travel through time from their sort of this peculiar and perhaps not well understood neurodivergent embeddedness in naturing, maybe, to draw Spinoza back in there, probably unnecessarily, just to further complicate things. But it's that kind of, I mean, maybe you kind of see it in that science fiction film Lucy with Scarlett Johansson. That's maybe kind of even a better model that's more contemporary of this kind of she has this, she becomes this kind of informational being almost, who can do and think anything at all times, and it's kind of superhuman, post-human entity that nevertheless initially, before it's technologized and made all sci-fi, presents itself as schizophrenia. She's just totally, she's everywhere all at once, and is capable of seeing anything that can happen. There's a sort of weirdness in the sort of WYRD Shakespearean weird sisters sense of being able to see all futures and all pasts, and be and just sort of go with that flow, as it were.
And it's interesting as well that the way that, again, the way that Deleuze and Guattari talk about the body without organs is that the journey to the body without organs, as they put it, is into experimentation, is the word they use. It is to have a relationship with not just our bodies, but also just with our whole, well, to use the Heideggerian term, our whole being in the world, our Dasein almost, to have this attitude and relationship with it, where it is this kind of, where the body without organs, as they put it, is it is the limit, but it's also kind of like the ground of desire. It is where if we move away from the strata, away from the organism, and down towards the body without organs, down to the plane, then when we reach there, we discover the possibility that is actually open to us at all times, is present with us here right now. Because one of the very interesting things they state is that when we talk about sort of the journey to the body without organs, they don't mean regression into an early organic state. They don't mean sort of like the travel back into childhood and ultimately back into the womb. It is the body without organs is contemporary. It is a possibility that we always carry with us right now and immediately. And indeed, they even suggest at one point that we actually encounter and travel into the body without organs every day of our lives in some way or another, and that we always presume, by which I understand them as saying that we always are actually kind of like encountering our own possibilities and drawing into ourselves to reckon with ourselves in some capacity or another. in another place in this essay, they say that the journey into the body without organs is the experience of a creative involution, of a entering into our own possibilities, so that these possibilities can actually become real. And again, not symbolically real, not metaphorically or conceptually real, but really real. They become things that we actually are encountering and becoming right now, here, right now. There's a passage towards the end of the essay, which I really, really enjoyed, where they start talking about Carlos Castaneda, of all people, who it might be someone that our listeners aren't aware of, but he wrote a bunch of books in which he purported to kind of like describe his initiation into a pre-Columbian Mesoamerican, Native American spiritual tradition, into a shamanic tradition, and it is now like known uncontroversially that he made it up, like it is fiction that he was writing about. But Deleuze and Guattari used this unknowingly fictive kind of like example to kind of explain what they're to try and explain kind of the process of kind of entering in to the body without organs. Let me just find the I won't read the whole thing because it's very long, but just to give you an idea. In the course of Castaneda's books, the reader may begin to doubt the existence of the Indian Don Juan and many other things besides, but that has no importance. So much better if the books are a syncretism rather than an ethnographical study, and the protocol of an experiment rather than an account of an initiation. The fourth book, Tales of Power, is about the living distinction between the tonal and the nagual. The tonal seems to cover many disparate things. It is the organism, and also that is organised and organising. But it is also significance, and all that is signifying or signified, all that is susceptible to interpretation, explanation, all that is memorizable in the form of something recalling something else. Finally, it is the self, the subject, the historical, social, individual person, and the corresponding feelings. In short, the tonal is everything, including God, the judgment of God, since it makes up the rules by which it apprehends the world. So, in a manner of speaking, it creates the world. Yet the tonal is only an island, for the nagual is also everything. And it is the same everything, but under such conditions that the body without organs has replaced the organism, and experimentation has replaced all interpretation for which it no longer has any use. And I think that at the ends there, the distinction between interpretation and experimentation is precisely what they're driving at, not a mediated experience with the flows of desire and the flows of intensity, but rather an imminent, an actual experimental happening, doing, touching encounter with the things themselves, with ourselves as bodies without organs, both socially and literally physically.
Yeah. I think it's the sorry, were you gonna
just to
sorry, yeah, no, please. Sorry, I interrupted.
That's all right. And yes, this is, and what's you can find here is an almost a spiritual, which is probably what they wouldn't have liked, but an almost like an experiential spirituality here, or a mysticism pregnant in this almost, and I'm just drawing from because I'm just picking my own tangents here, but drawing from a book I've been kind of working my way through over lockdown, called Meditations on, but this is going to sound so fucking witchy, but it is more proper than it sounds. Meditations of a Tarot, which is an anonymous book written by an anthroposophist called Valentin Tomberg, which is essentially a very thick primer into the Hermetic tradition, into Hermeticism as a mystical practice. And precisely one of the things that he mentions very early on in this book is when he kind of talks about these kind of like four kinds of knowledge almost, which he calls the mystical, the gnostic, the magical, and the philosophical or the hermetic. And I won't go into too much details about it, but because this is a Deleuze podcast, damn it, be materialists here. But when he he uses different metaphors of sensation to describe the process of involvement with divine knowledge, and it begins with the mystical, and the analogy he uses for the mystical is the sensation of touching, because to touch something is an experience which does not kind of inherently embody interpretation. Almost like the encounter of the touch is more immediate than anything else. It is this kind of like sudden, unmistakable happening. And he uses wonderful language. He talks about the mystical as the experience of touching silence, not hearing but touching silence. And again, there is this kind of same spiritual, mystical sense embedded in. I mean, maybe it can't help but be embedded in it because they're using shamanic metaphors here. But in the travel into the body without organs, as it is a journey. It is a mystical journey. And you can absolutely still characterize it as a mystical journey while being a materialist. You don't have to, you don't have to sort of like find the supernatural in here or the non-scientific in here. It is, but it's on the level kind of like the reality of the experiential of discussing what the actual phenomenological experience of the encounter of the body without organs is. That's it. It is the experience. It is the touch. It is the cutting through language, going beyond, not only beyond the judgment of God, but beyond language and signification and signifying into just the sheer happening of experience itself, which can be very dangerous. But I'm going to throw it back to you because again, I've gone on a long ramble.
Yeah, no, I think that's it brings me back to Virginia Woolf, who has this line where she says, I think in The Waves actually, which probably again is probably another perfect example of a book that is all event without body, but that's another can of worms. But there's a line in, I think, towards the very, very end of that book where she says, "How to describe the world seen without a self? There are no words." And with that, the book ends. But I feel like that is essentially in a very sort of poetic nutshell the sort of experience or understanding that Deleuze is trying to reach out to. And yeah, as you say, there's a spiritual element there that's kind of unavoidable. But I feel like that's partly what I meant really at the start, where sort of, what did I say? Something about that as much as it's the sort of paradox of there's a way to somewhat superficially describe these things that we have no access to. I mean, for Spinoza, that's God, God common nature is he sees the two as indistinguishable. How we have as much chance of getting to know God as we do nature, which is kind of probably more so than Kant would argue, but there's something else in there too. But there's this paradox almost that to actually ground that suggestion in this kind of philosophical rigor takes a great deal of language to even get close to that which language, that which is beyond words. And it's this thing that I think it's really interesting that's that it's not so much like a. I think you're right that it's spiritual in the sense that it's not just this kind of stoner talk. It's not just saying like, isn't it cool, man, that we have to say so much to talk about nothing. But there's like
OMG.
This, yeah. But but there's like there's an ethical imperative in there, I think, which is that and it's something that I think Mark Fisher also sort of draws upon. So like the last book that I don't even think it was an essay that he finished, but one of the very last things that Deleuze, or was published by Deleuze, I think it was maybe one of the first things to be published posthumously, was an unfinished or at least somewhat finished essay called Pure Immanence, colon a life. And I think what it's another example of that kind of stripping back this, talking about being in the world, or or life or existence for Heidegger, nonetheless have I think it's the problem of phenomenology, that phenomenology is understanding sensations from a first person perspective, whereas for Deleuze as this kind of post phenomenological figure, the interest is in understanding these sensations from a sort of non-person perspective. How can we actually talk about these things as they are without our sort of subjective fuzz? And again, that's sort of Spinoza's thing too, right? That in sort of being, psychoanalysis 300 years early, as Mark Fisher argues. But for Deleuze, so the gesture for Deleuze is that how do you understand life without recourse to a self, subject, or personal identity, or how do you understand life in a way that's not in opposition to nature or matter or inert objects? How do you understand life out of opposition to death? And these are kinds of questions that are quite they're as much philosophical as they are theological, I think, in a lot of ways. But it's also something that Mark Fisher makes a similar argument, where it's that he tries to his Spinoza's view of depression, which is not to do what neoliberalism implores us to do, which is think of depression or any kind of mental illness as that's a kind of personal responsibility, but to impersonalize that affect or those sensations, and consider what are the sort of structural forces that are producing it out, or as much inside of you as outside of you. How do you impersonalize that which you personally are going through, and actually doing that is a sort of rational, what Mark would call a sort of psychedelic rationalism, or a psychedelic reason, where you are imploring yourself to engage in a kind of out-of-body experience that allows you to better understand the structure. Not, it's a kind of, it's like a sort of an esoteric science in a way, or something like that, where it's, it both has this, it has this theological bent, where it's sort of trying to understand these impersonal forces around us, or at least spiritual, probably rather than theological, but also, it's also innately rational and scientific. That both science and religion are both trying to explain and find reasons for these impersonal forces. So obviously they're going to share a language and share a certain kind of momentum. And in a way, it's, I think, for Deleuze especially, there's a really interesting, not just a sort of stepping away from these categories of, or models of thought, or images of thought, these dogmatic images of thought, but allowing all these different modes of seeing the world to be recombined together to produce something new. So in the sense that he can refer to Castaneda in one chapter and then go on to talking about the theoretical mathematics in another one. But in a way, he's always talking about the same sort of project, it's spirituality, or it's geology, or it's psychoanalysis, or it's geopolitics, or every kind of dogmatic image of thought at his disposal is redeployed to in service of this kind of ethical imperative to understand life without recourse to a self.
I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head there, especially the ethical imperative. I mean, the name of the essay is "How do you make yourself a body without organs?" This is a happening. Again, so the essay is an experimental protocol. It's all telling us how do you do it, not what is. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It's not called what is a body without organs. It's how do you make one? How do you make yourself a body without organs? Which
is a paradox too, though, right? Because it's the whole point is like how to make yourself a body without organs is to remove yourself.
And this is precisely the paradox that they play with towards the end of the essay, because like the process of kind of like discovering the body without organs and creating the body without organs is basically it's the same thing. It is, you have to make it. You have to make yourself a body without organs, even though it's something that is there always with you. You have to make it at the same time, and the way that you do so is to slough off the organs, to follow the lines of flight out of the midst of the strata, which is they're standing for religion, law, state, language, capital, the mechanisms whereby we are defined. And in order to arrive at the body without organs, which is still a project of our own creation, even if it is immanent and pre-existent at the same time. But one of the things that, like, this is why I said it is a dangerous process, is the thing is that you can fail you can try and fail. And which is why they begin with, which is why I read out earlier, going through the hypochondriac body, the masochist, the paranoid, and so on. And because these are not the bodies without organs you want to arrive at. These are the ones they put it, and I don't quite know what they mean here. So these are the bodies without organs which are empty and not filled, where they want to, well, they especially talk about the masochist, and they describe in quite graphic terms sort of like a program of masochistic abuse, of sort of like being stitched up, so every orifice and every kind of like fold of the body is kind of like pressed together, so you become a single kind of contiguous, featureless, smooth space upon which the intensities can move, and which is not what you want. That's not what you want to end up. And how you end up in this dangerous place is through, as they put it, through a too drastic destratification. Because you said earlier, Matt, when we were talking about the body without organs as lying outside of language, beyond language, but all the same, we needed a hell of a lot of words to get to it. This is precisely the thing, that you can't just rip away language in order to bring yourself to the body without organs, because that kills you. So, like, in fact, they precisely say you do need a self to survive. We do need the strata. We do need stratification. We do need order and mechanism in order to actually have our existence. But what we also need in order for that existence to be joyous, or possibly to be disastrous, is also the line of flight to the body without organs, where we also disassemble the strata, where we have both the inevitable reterritorialization and of the deterritorialization as well, and the I forget what point I was going to make coming off of that, actually, but they also do. The other caution they make is they add, towards the end of the essay, they add a different kind of negative body without organs to the list of the ones you don't want to end up with, which is the cancerous body without organs, which is basically it's the Nazi Stalinist body. It's the one you do not. This is one of the ones you do not want to end up with. There's also one which, if you create it, it reproduces quickly and is difficult to eliminate. And not that I want to get especially topical, because that would make this a boring podcast, but we are possibly just kind of like looking over the edge of a post-Trump America as we record this. I mean, actually, that makes this vaguer than I realised it would, because the actual situation in America, like, we're recording this on the 12th of November, so Joe Biden has won, but at the same time, it apparently looks like he might still somehow lose because of the antiquated... I mean, Christ, I thought we had an antiquated system where God still chooses our head of state over here, but like the American system is just bafflingly awful compared with even like the juddering mess that is constitutional monarchy. Well, that's what happens if you destratify too quickly. They should have kept the Queen, apparently. Anyway,
you got to stick with the body without organs, not elections without counting. It's like.
But the reason why I want to briefly bring up Trump is precisely the thing that we all know, is that as does seem likely, he's not going to be president next, after January. It's unlikely that's going to happen, touch wood. But Trumpism isn't going to go away, because 17 million Americans still voted for him, and this is precisely where using this kind of non-personal language, non-self-centered language, becomes really, really useful, because we're not talking about the guy Donald Trump. We're talking about the body without organs he represents, almost. We're talking about the cancerous body without organs, which is Trumpism, which has very powerfully multiplied and is kind of like greedily constructing all sorts of strata upon itself and spreading and spreading and spreading and spreading. And, it is anyone's guess where it's actually going to end up. in 18 months to 2 years even. You know, it is perfectly possible that a Biden president, that it will just fade away into nothingness and turn to dust over the course of a Biden presidency. Or it could become a permanent feature of American political life. You know, some analysts have drawn comparisons with Peronism, for instance, which, you know, even when Peron wasn't president, was still an active political force and something that had to be reckoned with and did indeed set the agenda for like just decades and decades to come. And maybe this is a similar, and this is again why we, and this is the one. You know, this is one of the great faults of liberalism, in that it thinks about people and not systems, right? In that the way that we have been thinking about American politics is in these highly personalized terms about Biden and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and Mike Pence. But we need to be thinking about it in terms of what are their bodies without organs? Because, like I said, the body without organs is not undifferentiated. It conditions the events. It conditions what traverses the planes. And developing an understanding of what those conditions are, which actually bring about these events, that is the actual question. That is the actual task on our hands here, more than just this endless psychoanalyzing of Trump's various obvious, you know, pathologies and neuroses, or or indeed actually the same with Biden. You know, so the endless speculation about his possible like failing health. Almost, you know, precisely the question is to discuss the mechanisms that are happening underneath them, to discuss the bodies without organs upon which they sit.
Yeah, I think it's this. I think part of the issue is expressed in Logic of Sense, in a way where Deleuze is both sort of exercising his initial critiques of psychoanalysis while still deploying a lot of psychoanalytic language. But this idea that you can sort of become a body without, or you know, travel towards find the line of flight towards a body without organs and go in the wrong direction. I kind of think of it as, you know, Deleuze writes a lot on sadism and masochism, for instance. And this is true, I think, of Lacan as well, which... I can't remember what it was that you said now initially, and when you started talking about the election, but it was something that triggered this in my brain, so hopefully it will make sense. But there's this provocative sort of amalgamation that happens around this sort of the sort of post-structuralist era of attaching Immanuel Kant and the Marquis de Sade, and sort of saying that Desade's sort of sadistic writings and pornographic writings, I imagine Deleuze would actually disagree with that, calling it pornography, or maybe would he? Anyway, I can't remember. But you know, the issue is that, you know, how is it that the cashing out Kantian Enlightenment thought, you know, taken to its extreme, leads to Desade, leads to sadism. And Lacan kind of makes this argument, but we sort of see after then there's this movement happens where this sadism that is sort of out there in society kind of gets sublated and is internalized. So, you know, masochism isn't sadism's opposite, but it's kind of an internalized sadism, or even thinking of sadism as a kind of externalized masochism. And part of the problem, I think, for when it comes to psychoanalysis, is that in a lot of this pathologizing, we can risk, you know, boarding up the house in a way, and finding ourselves ricocheting between these two positions. We're either sadists or we're masochists. And I feel like, in a way, that's kind of what we see happening a lot in contemporary politics, especially when it comes to sort of the populist right, where you have this, you know, we have this idea of a working class, especially, that is masochistic. That you know, to take Lyotard's line, that the working class is love sort of they love swallowing the shit of capital. They love their pubs and their shopping malls, and they love toiling away in the mines and breaking apart their bodies. He makes the argument that actually we can have, what the bourgeois academics will never get is that you can desire that kind of work. You can take pride in it. We see ideologically how that kind of masochistic work ethic, that performance principle, as Freud would call it, or rather Marcuse would call it, ends up being instantiated. But then the problem that we see is that when we see a working class that doesn't want that anymore, that wants to be freed from its drudgery, it goes the wrong direction, and it takes its internalized sadism, its masochism, and externalizes it into figures like Trump that are just sort of geopolitical sadists that just want to punish everybody, and sort of lash out at the world around them. These sort of figureheads that just sort of transpose those frustrations and resentments. And I feel like that, in a way, that's the body with organs going the wrong way. To leave your own masochism shouldn't end up projecting. Shouldn't if you to escape your own masochistic tendencies and end up then supporting a sadist is kind of like, you're stuck in the bind of this kind of sub-dom relationship that's like not going to get you anywhere. And there's a lot to say about that. How that relationship is kind of like at all levels. Like, and Deleuze writes at length on how the masochist in a way is already a body without organs. In the way that it kind of is, the way that the masochist seeks to be treated, in being bound up and sewed up and whatever else, is a kind of way of expressing, that in a way allow your masochism to leak out in the bedroom. That's where you become the body without organs. To let your masochism leak out into politics is kind of is another thing altogether. And I think that it's those kind of like that to me anyway. Yeah, that feels particularly clear when we look at these sort of this ping pong game of reactionary politics between like a resentful working class that is in its the chicken and the egg of reactionary working class and a reactionary politics, or a reactionary establishment rather, that has kind of plagued the political landscape for the best part of 50-60 years. I think that in a way that's Deleuze's ethical imperative sort of cashing out in the worst possible way, but we can't then say that he didn't warn us.
We've been talking for I think a little over an hour now. Were there any final points that you wanted to bring up, Matt, or
there was kind of one thing that maybe it does kind of attach on to what you were saying about kind of bodily neurosis, and I guess maybe I think it's maybe a melancholic note to end on, but I think it's one way of understanding the body without organs within the context of Deleuze's own life, which I always find useful personally, and I feel like it's worth noting that. I mean, part of the way that I've always understood how that kind of thinking works is kind of moving beyond a kind of biological understanding. Happens through this odd hop, skip, jump, starting with Nietzsche, going via Guattari, and ending up with Deleuze. And I think what joins each of them is there's like this, each of them in their personal lives either suffer from quite drastic physical ailments and or have seen loved ones struggle with illnesses that literally ravage the body. And that's true of Nietzsche in the one sense where Nietzsche famously went mad, but supposedly it was also his father. There was said that Nietzsche he died from syphilis, but actually I think it was there's evidence that now suggests it was a kind of hereditary disease. I think that on the post-mortem, there was an excellent biography of Nietzsche by Sue Perdue that came out a year or two ago, and she has this excellent discussion in the book of how actually trying the attempts to understand what happened to Nietzsche go down into his own family, and that they unearthed the post-mortem report on his father, where his cause of death was attributed to softening of the brain. And I think that's often she makes the case that's often been interpreted as being like syphilis, but actually, in modern parlance, it's a name for any number of not well understood cognitive issues, whether it's just dementia or a brain tumor or cancer or bleeding, or there's all these different kinds of causes. And anyway, the suggestion is that this was a hereditary thing, and actually there's some sort of there's a large part of Nietzsche's thought, his eternal return, his sort of love of fate, his amor fati. All of this is inspired by this innate understanding that he comes from a sickly family, and that his body, despite how much he might be able to sort of travel outside the bounds of his his contemporary moment through thought, he's kind of a prisoner in his own body that is innately degenerative. And I think there's an affinity there that then Bataille takes up, and Bataille sort of deals with these very similar questions around the impossible. But Bataille doesn't suffer from anything himself, but he watches his father deteriorate. And initially Bataille thinks to go into the priesthood, but ends up going in a different direction. But anyway, Bataille also, as a teenager, watched his father go mad from syphilis. And there's lots that Stuart Kendall, again, another biographer, has written a great deal on this, where he sort of argues that what saves George Bataille from the priesthood is the emergence of psychoanalysis, where he's struck by the fact that despite Bataille would write that in his first novel, The Story of the Eye, that what upsets him most is seeing his father shit a great many times. That it's hard for him to get out of bed and settle on his chamber pot, that his eyes stare out into space, he has these lightning sharp pains that make him howl, and he's foul tempered, and he swears, and he says the most disgusting things to him and his brother and his mother. But despite all of this terror of watching his father deteriorate, Bataille still loves his father despite his degradation. So Bataille, in a way, I think, shares that affinity with Nietzsche, and takes up that kind of thought of not just how you deal with that kind of the eternal return for yourself, but how you understand that kind of horror for the sake of another. How you can not just how you're not tolerating your own personal pain, but tolerating another's pain who's very close to you. And I think in a way that there's a lot. I don't think, but Deleuze was a particular fan of Bataille and maybe sees him as going down this sort of, Bataille's masochism in loving his father despite himself ends up cashing out in him writing a kind of a lot about a kind of kind of sadistic writing practice. He's as much influenced by de Sade as he is by Nietzsche. And Deleuze also had a great number of lung problems. When throughout his entire career and life, I think he defended his initial doctoral thesis maybe not long after or not long before he had a thoraplaxy. He had a lung removed because he had quite striking a lot of suffering in that regard. And it's said that Deleuze committed suicide in 1995 by jumping out of the window of his apartment. And a lot of theories have been made that Deleuze isn't really talked about as a philosopher that committed suicide. And I think in a way it's partly because of his philosophy in this regard, that it's not a depressive act for him or a kind of insane act. In a way, it's a very rational act. That he in taking the influence of this thinking that's happened over the sort of decades, the previous century of philosophy, that's in an odd way so defined and so inspired by a biology, in the sense of Nietzsche was around at the first was writing when we first sort of discovered or understood the idea that you are what you eat, that you can have some sort of impact on your own well-being through the choices that you make at all. But Nietzsche sort of sees that fact and sees a sort of Promethean power in that, whilst at the same time, being trapped within his own body. And I feel like, but Deleuze sees a similar sort of thing, but asks that kind of Humean question, that rational question of suicide. That actually, it's not a depressive act for him, but rather the way to that's him seeing his life impersonally. To say, this, how would I understand this? What is in a sense a kind of it's quite a horrific way to die, but nevertheless you wonder if there'd been such a thing as assisted dying, if that was even a concept, he would have quite clearly have gone for that instead. That he was very rationally thinking not just about his life but about his death, and that allowed him to go out on his own terms. And whilst I think that's quite, it's, as I said before, it's a very bleak point to end on potentially, but I think that's one way that shows how this thinking about, quite literal thinking about organs, about an ethical imperative within your own life, despite maybe how the body without organs is kind of renowned, almost memeified as a concept, as being this kind of salaciously complex idea that you must fucking explain to me now or I will kill you, that sort of whole thing. But actually, I think for Deleuze it was not, it wasn't, it was a material concern quite explicitly. He knew what it was like to be in a body without, at least without one organ, that's for sure, but also to be in a body that is in revolt against you, despite whatever rational, thought you may be able to throw at it. That, there's no kind of level of philosophy that can actually explain away the fact that your lungs don't work. But you can at least, that in a way, it's, there's no sort of sense of philosophy that makes sense of having that quality. But there is a sort of a way of philosophizing that can at least inspire you and inform you of what to do with it, what to do with the lot that you've been given, and how to make the best for yourself in one way, but also sort of beyond anything to do with yourself. What rationally makes sense for you to do beyond this recourse to societal expectations or the rule of law or whatever else? What was your body crying out for? How to understand desire on that level, I think it's a really powerful question, a powerful gesture, that ground Deleuze's thought in very real consequences, for himself most of all.
I think that is an absolutely fascinating note to end this on. We will be back in, I think we're aiming for getting one of these done every couple of weeks, but it's going to be dependent upon the other myriad factors in our chaotic, confusing lives. So thank you for joining us. We will be back soon. We're not quite sure when. We'll be back soon with another episode in which we'll be talking about. I'm not quite sure yet. I think we might actually have it like agreed earlier, but I don't know what. We'll see. We'll see what we're going to talk about. I also don't know what, if any, theme music this podcast is going to have. So I hope whatever it is we end up with, that you enjoy it. And if we decide to put it out with total silence at either end, I hope you touch the silence and find it meaningful. So thank you very much, listeners. We have been Buddies Without Organs. I'm Sean. You can find me on Twitter at Horntonaut. And Matt, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Xenogothic on Twitter and xenogothic.com for everything else.
Great stuff. Well then, until next time, au revoir.
Ta-ra.